Hello, mysterious listener, prepare to be captivated as we delve into the world of books and share genuine reviews straight from the hearts of passionate readers.
Sit back, relax, and let's explore the enlightening feedback shared by the customers who experienced this book firsthand. Let's begin.
Oh, wow. I have just finished listening to the entire 44-hour, 53-minute long audiobook of It by Stephen King and loved nearly every second. Would I recommend listening to this as an audiobook rather than reading it? Yes. With incredible narration and long chapters, this is the perfect listen for a long plane journey, while you're inputting data at work, or to accompany you when you're doing mundane everyday tasks by yourself. The story is just brilliant, with excellent setting, plotting and characterization. Obviously no book is perfect, but this is an epic horror novel worth reading/listening to. The story. For those who don't know, It by Stephen King follows the lives of Bill Denbrough, Ben Hanscom, Richie Tozier, Beverly Marsh, Eddie Kasprak, Mike Hanlon, and Stanley Uris as adults and children growing up in the haunted town of Derry. However, Derry is only haunted for children, by it, which appears in many different forms depending on your fears. The most popular form it takes is that of Pennywise the Clown, which was capitalized on in the popular movie adaptations. It begins by introducing the characters as adults being told that they need to return to Derry because it has returned, and they promise that they would come back if things started up again. Seamlessly weaving between their lives as children and lives as adults, King tells the story of the children who it has killed and the children who tried to stop it in their efforts to stop it completely as adults. What I loved about this book. First off, the audio is just perfect. Steven Weber gives every character their own unique voice, and once you get past his version of Stuttering Bill, which can be a bit annoying, you start to appreciate his acting skills vastly. I especially liked how it had more than one voice depending on the circumstance, and how he managed to do all of Richie's voices just right so that they sounded like they were coming from him. I could genuinely picture the characters in my head from Weber's telling of the story. The story of It by Stephen King is very clever. It is a unique story, and I don't think that any horror novel based around kids in a small town will ever measure up, and will always be compared. From the characters returning to the town that touched them as adults, showing the parallels in just how easily it can return them to their childlike personas, Bill's stuttering, Richie's glosses, etc. This is a very in-depth novel which has been plotted carefully and the characters drafted with care. Seeing how King paralleled the battle scenes with the children in it, I do wonder how they plan on recreating it in It Part 2, out next September, as I now see it as one story, not two. However, as I read in a post by The Bewitched Reader, I have to agree that King's use of racial slurs and Beverly as the only female in the friendship group is at times questionable. While I understand that, even as adults, the characters were returning to their childish natures in order to battle it once more, I agree that little character development is shown in way of the treatment of Mike and Stan, especially by Richie. He does note when things might be offensive through use of beep beep, Richie, but this is more of a friendly joke. Furthermore, what the hell is with that scene? I am not sure how high King was when he wrote that in there, but it literally makes no sense, exploits child erotica, all while suggesting that Beverly's only use is that all of them can be connected through her private parts. WTH? Everything else about Beverly is great, and many tomboys with male friends would relate to her, except from this incident. Overall, It by Stephen King is a brilliant story and an even better audiobook, thanks to the talented Steven Weber. I would recommend to fans of the film, King fans who haven't yet read it, and anybody who loved The Chalk Man or Stranger Things. I once again applaud one of my favorite authors of all time for this smashing read. It is the shortest of titles for probably one of the longest books most of us will ever read in this genre. It is the simplest of titles for probably one of the deepest and multi-layered horror books in existence. It really is something special and one of my personal all-time favorite books, though I wonder how people coming fresh to it now might see it. More to the point, I doubt such a book as this would survive a modern editor's attentions intact. King didn't throw everything but the kitchen sink at it. He threw that first and then started ripping up the floor tiles and threw them and everything else besides at it too. The book follows the stories of a group of children and how they find each other through the debris of their dysfunctional childhoods and then into their adult lives, using a non-linear dual timeline to cover both. Each of them suffers a form of abuse, and of course, with it being King, are not spared from more supernatural horrors. King imbues each of his characters with real depth and personality. He doesn't seem to believe in extras either, with even bit-part characters like barman and a taxi driver who only appear fleetingly being given detail and personality of their own. The narration. I was somehow expecting creepy, but Steven Weber is bright and breezy, particularly well suited to the childhood plots, and moves things along at a refreshing pace. Where he scores highly is the way he almost literally throws himself into the emotion of each of King's carefully realized situations. The combination of writer and narrator is stunningly powerful at times, and the tension ratchets up to extreme levels during the most important encounters. As you read through the book, what's impressive is that King holds the attention both to the coming-of-age tale of the children, including their experience of bullying, parental situations and the like, as he does with the outright horror of it. The adults have equally compelling tales, as does the town of Derry itself. By the end of the book you will feel like a regular Derry old-timer, able to recount tales of its history to any young uns that might happen along. The only question in my mind is for anyone coming to this fresh. Listening to King's other classics like The Stand and The Dead Zone, stories I am revisiting decades later, I have been delighted by how vibrant and fresh they felt after all this time. With it I do have some nagging doubts. Clowns weren't exactly new in horror when King wrote the book in 1986, but in the intervening years we've had a lot of horror clowns, and they have become a quite hackneyed aspect of horror. Coupling that with the lack of editorial censure King was subjected to, and I do suspect some might not find it as entertaining as I have. And although, regardless of those things, this is one of the absolute horror classics, and the way that King ends it for this group of grown-up children is incredibly poignant. This is a long journey and a dark path to tread, but I am so glad I walked it again 30 years on. In a way that parallel to the story made me feel in some small way a part of it. This is the second time I have read this book, and like with most second readings I have changed enough to find a new book under the old story, a more profound take on the true horror some children experience growing up. The biggest monster in this story is the everyday neglect and abuse all the children in this tale suffer, and how even though they leave it behind they must confront it within the reality and constraints of adulthood. Children dream, create blinds, hide in magical world, or plain obliterate monsters with disregard and forgetfulness of entire events they cannot deal with, but with supreme imagination, with incredible survival skills that adults forget or want to forget. King illustrates this in some of the recurring trauma with incredible tact and love for innocence. He speaks for children while making their fears come alive and take shapes we can understand, or should I say want to understand, as monstrosities and not as everyday fears of our children. Because if people had been told that this book is about child abuse, they would not have made it the success it is. Much easier to sell a killer clown who wants to hear about a little girl that is abused by her father and then her husband, or a fat hypochondriac kid that carries all his mother's fears plus an eatable complex the size of Maine, or a boy that was bitten and abused till he becomes a monster. But it is about this and so much more than that. The clown is just a manifestation, a device for a great author to tell us you could have been them or you were them. They hold magic, care for them, or it becomes cycle of horror. Read it, you will love it. The reasons are many, but keep your eyes open. King hides the horror where we dare not look. I finally got round to playing Stephen King's It after having it in my library for quite some time, and after listening to nearly 45 hours of inane boring drudgery with a storyline that's disappointing and farcical. I really wish I hadn't bothered. Having read a few of Stephen King's books, there is no doubt that while the quality of a number of his creations are mixed, he certainly can write. Unfortunately, that's often where the problem lies. He seems to just start a story and continues to write, and write, and write, and you eventually land up with a large tome of a book that lands up being dull and senseless. The storyline of the book, if you can actually call it that, could have been completed in 10 to 12 hours at most. Instead of this, however, you are forced to listen to hour upon hour of pointless backstories on the characters involved, which are not only dull and some, they add little or nothing to this dreary tale. The narrator is clearly talented and does his best to add some excitement to the plot. However, his best endeavors are wasted on this one. Although I haven't seen either of the two movies based on this story, I can only recommend that you watch them instead. At least you won't have wasted so much of your time if you don't like them. I keep saying that Stephen King is a hack, so people send me to various books of his to prove me wrong. Spoilers alert, but he is some of the things that made me realize I was right. Firstly, King confuses this would be scary if it happened with this would be scary in a book. Mummies from old horror movies aren't scary. A kid being chased by Rodan isn't scary. It is in real life. I'd hate to be chased by Rodan, but in a book it's just silly. Secondly, he always uses clumsy goth merengue language in his books. My favorite example being the description of the sound of someone's jacket being torn by a werewolf sounding like a weird fart. Did he want us to laugh? Did he want to shift the tone of the scene that much? Thirdly, he uses silly devices he probably thinks are clever, like dropping inner monologue in the middle of a sentence. He rushed to the door, grabbing the handle. Oh God, please let it be. and twisting it open. Or the super annoying places where he ends a sentence halfway through and then picks it up in the next section. It became tedious. I admit he couldn't do it once or it would be odd, but then when it's used so often that it becomes annoying you might as well leave it out. Finally, he doesn't know how to end books and certainly doesn't know how to do interesting metaphors or symbolism. For example, your main characters are all 11. They've all got troubled lives and things they need to deal with. They all also have odd behaviors or characteristics, or even objects, that they carry around with them as mementos of their oddness. So what do you do when you get them to enter adulthood and shed their innocence? Make Bill lose his stutter? Make Eddie throw away his asthma medicine? Make Bev stand up to her father or get Richie to stop avoiding things through jokes? No, you get them to have sex with each other. Because you're a hack writer who doesn't see the setup you've created but are too unimaginative to use yourself. It's not even as if I'm offended by the kids having sex at this stage. There was nothing in the hours leading up to that scene that suggested that any of them would have considered that to be something they'd ever do. So using it as a symbol of their move into adulthood is not only too literal in many respects, it's also missing some of the better ways in which he could have done it with the material he already had. In the literal demolition of Derry at the end, oh my god man. He destroys a whole town, which adds nothing to the story, doesn't stand as any great metaphor for anything, and takes up another hour of the audiobook without anything interesting happening. Absolute nonsense. Also, he uses the word chuckling to describe the river moving over the rocks about 50 times, and the phrase, such and such, shrieked/screamed is used on almost every page. And Bill is a tool. He cheats on his wife and then we're supposed to feel all warm when he tries to save her from a coma at the end. Didn't seem that concerned when you were all up in Beverly's mosh, you dirty git. I'm not generally a fan of oversized books. Once in a while I'll read an epic if the premise sounds really interesting or the prose and storytelling are especially good, but I have commitment issues. By page 400, I'm likely to want to change, and if there are still 700 pages to go, I'm inclined to get jittery. This is not so much an issue if the work is broken down into a trilogy or series, with more or less self-contained volumes contributing towards a bigger story. It is a single volume 1,100 pages long, or over 44 hours. That's nearly as long as the original Dune trilogy, and much longer than his doc materials. It covers a few days in 1958, and a few days in 1985, frequently switching between the two periods. For those unaware of the mini-series and the forthcoming film, the eponymous it is a supernatural creature of seemingly unlimited powers who usually takes the form of a clown called Pennywise. It likes to bully, torture and murder people, especially children. The story concerns 7 children, and also their grown-up selves, who form a strong friendship and who decide to take on the evil Harlequin. The most joyful aspect of the book, for me, is the perspective on childhood, both lived at the time and later remembered. The horror has its moments too, but on the whole it's a bit too arbitrary and random. If the book had been a quarter of its actual length, I think it would have been a much tighter read, losing very little of the story we get. As it is, it's heavily padded out with repetition and very long digressions which are not always interesting. The narrator is very good, mostly, and I was tempted to give him 5 stars because of his Richie voices. However, I took 1 star off for the scenes when he's trying to be panicky or dramatic and starts shouting. Would you listen to it again? Why? Yes. I have been waiting, and requesting, for this audiobook for a long time. I really enjoyed the story. The narrator voiced the characters well and complimented the narrative. What did you like best about this story? Kids getting together to fight a cosmic force of evil. What more do you want? The ending was a little weak, though, as with a lot of King's texts. What does Steven Weber bring to the story that you wouldn't experience if you had only read the book? He's an excellent narrator. His accent certainly helps. Being British, when I read a book, I naturally read it in a British English accent, which isn't suitable, really, for this book. Was there a moment in the book that particularly moved you? I think the childhood scenes, especially when Bill Denborough's brother was murdered. Any additional comments? This audiobook is missing a couple of sentences throughout the narrative. I was following the book while listening. Also, chapters sometimes end in the middle of a sentence. This does not happen often, however. You know those times when all the reviews say that this is the best thing ever and tell you to go and buy this immediately, and you do, and never ever regretted it since, with the only regret being that you didn't heed the advice instantly? Yeah, this is one of those times. The sample doesn't do the narrator justice. The narrator is absolutely without a shadow of a doubt the most captivating storyteller I have ever heard in 27 years. Sample file on Audible X100. X1000. X over 9000. This is awesome if you struggle on long car journeys. BTW, nothing keeps you awake like horror. Smile. If you are still reading this, then stop your madness and buy it already. Or better yet, take this as your